Last night at 11:47 p.m., staff at Hargrove Neurological Institute in Baton Rouge, Louisiana discovered that room 14C, the room that had housed a completely unresponsive, brain-dead man for the better part of a decade, was empty. The bed was made. The monitors were dark. And on the pillow, pressed into the white cotton with what forensic analysts would later confirm was human skin oil, was a single, perfect fingerprint. By the time you finish watching this video, you will understand why that fingerprint terrified every law enforcement officer who saw it, because they had seen it before, 23 times before. And every single person who had been in the room where that print was found ended up in a body bag. To understand what we're dealing with, we have to go back to the beginning. Not to the empty hospital room. Not even to the first murder. We have to go back to a Tuesday morning in October of 2015, to a windowless laboratory on the 4th floor of the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab in Baton Rouge, and to a woman named Delia Marsh. Delia was 41 years old at the time, a senior evidence technician with 16 years on the job. People who worked with her described her as precise to the point of being unsettling. She wore her dark hair pulled back so tight it looked like it physically hurt, and she always smelled faintly of the acetic acid she used in her chemical development solutions. Her desk was immaculate. Her case files were color-coded. Her colleagues called her, with equal parts affection and unease, the machine. She had processed evidence from over 400 crime scenes in her career and had never, not once, made an error that held up to scrutiny in court. On that Tuesday morning, October 13, 2015, Delia was processing fingerprint lifts from what Baton Rouge PD was calling the Morrow Street homicide. A 34-year-old logistics coordinator named Raymond Phelps had been found dead in his kitchen 4 days earlier, strangled, with no signs of forced entry and no obvious suspects. It was a clean, quiet, deeply disturbing crime scene, the kind that tells you the killer was comfortable, unhurried, almost contemptuous of the investigation that would follow. Standard procedure. Delia dusted, lifted, photographed, cataloged. She ran the prints through AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system, the same way she had done thousands of times before. Most of the prints came back to Phelps himself, to his girlfriend, to his building super who'd been in 2 weeks prior to fix a radiator. But one print, lifted from the inside of the victim's refrigerator door handle, a location so specific, so deliberate, that Delia noted it in her report with a small asterisk, came back as a match to someone already in the system. The name that appeared on her screen was Marcus Allen Pruitt. Delia pulled the associated file without any particular sense of alarm. People with prior records left prints at crime scenes all the time. It was a significant portion of her caseload. But when the file loaded, she sat very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her desk phone and called her supervisor, a heavy-set former detective named Gerald Oubre, and said 4 words that she would later tell investigators she had never said before in 16 years of work. "Gerald, come look at this." What Oubre saw on that screen would quietly reroute the next 8 years of both their lives. Marcus Allen Pruitt, according to the Louisiana Department of Health and every medical record attached to his name, had been a patient at Hargrove Neurological Institute since August 3, 2013, more than 2 years before Raymond Phelps was murdered. He had been admitted following a catastrophic brain injury sustained in a car accident on I-10. He was, by every clinical definition available, in a persistent vegetative state. No voluntary movement, no measurable cortical activity, tube-fed, catheterized, turned by nurses every 4 hours to prevent bed sores. He could not open his eyes on command. He could not breathe reliably without assistance. He could not, under any interpretation of known medicine or physics, have been standing in Raymond Phelps' kitchen. And yet, there was his print, clean as a signature, right where the killer had stood. Delia Marsh went home that night and didn't sleep, which was fortunate in a horrible way because if she had, she might have closed the file. She might have chalked it up to contamination, to a database error, to one of a dozen mundane explanations that would have let everyone involved sleep a little easier. Instead, she went back through the archives. She pulled every unsolved homicide case the Baton Rouge PD and the surrounding parishes had logged since 2013, since the date Marcus Allen Pruitt had been admitted to Hargrove. She requested the physical evidence logs from 12 separate cases over an 8-day period, calling in favors, citing interdepartmental cooperation protocols. telling nobody exactly what she was looking for. What she found destroyed something in her. You could see it in the photographs taken of Delia Marsh in 2023 versus 2015. The tightness around her eyes. The way she had stopped wearing her hair pulled back, as if even that small, controlled precision had become unbearable. Over the course of 8 years, across 23 separate homicide investigations spanning 4 Louisiana parishes, the same fingerprint appeared. Always in an intimate location. Always somewhere the killer had no reason to touch unless they were completely at ease. The inside of a medicine cabinet. The underside of a kitchen table. The back of a framed photograph that had been turned, ever so slightly, to face the wall. 23 victims. 23 scenes. One print. Always his. Marcus Allen Pruitt. Who had not moved, spoken, or demonstrated awareness of his surroundings since the summer of 2013. And last night at 11:47 p.m., the nurse who went to perform his routine overnight vitals check found his room empty. His foreline neatly coiled on the mattress and on the pillow, pressed there with a precision that Delia Marsh herself would later describe as almost professional. A single fingerprint. The same one. The question that nobody in Louisiana law enforcement can answer this morning. The question that has been building quietly and monstrously for 8 years is not how a brain-dead man left prints at 23 murder scenes. The question is, where is he going next? But before we talk about where Marcus Allen Pruitt went, we need to talk about who Marcus Allen Pruitt actually was. Because for 8 years, that question had been treated as almost secondary, a biographical footnote attached to an impossible forensic mystery. Law enforcement had been so consumed by the what that nobody had looked hard enough at the who. That changed on the morning of November 14, 2023, approximately 10 hours after the room in Hargrove Neurological Institute was found empty. A detective named Corinne Batiste, 38 years old, 6 years with the Louisiana State Police Major Crimes Unit, sat down in a conference room in Baton Rouge with a box of files that had been compiled, cross-referenced, and quietly assembled by Delia Marsh over the better part of a decade. Delia had not been authorized to build that file. She had done it anyway, the way people do when something has burrowed so deeply into their thinking that it stops being a case and starts being a compulsion. Corinne Batiste would later say, in a recorded debrief, that she opened that box expecting to find the obsessive documentation of a woman who had gone too far down a rabbit hole. What she found instead was something she described, off the record, to a colleague as the most coherent, most terrifying argument I have ever read. Because Delia hadn't just catalogued the prints. She had mapped the victims. Raymond Fels, strangled in his kitchen on Morrow Street, October 2015. Paula Drennan, 52, a retired schoolteacher found in her bathtub in Prairieville, February 2016. Terry Okafor, 29, discovered in a parking structure in Metairie, July 2016. The list continued, one name at a time, spreading across 4 parishes and 8 years like something patient. Something methodical. Delia had spent months cross-referencing the victims, their occupations, their neighborhoods, their medical histories, their social networks, searching for the thread that connected them to each other and, more importantly, to Marcus Allen Pruitt. She found it, and it was worse than anyone had anticipated. 11 of the 23 victims had, at some point in the 5 years preceding their deaths, worked for or had documented contact with a private neurological research firm called Vantara Biomedical. Vantara was headquartered in New Orleans, registered in 2010, and had, according to public records, received 3 separate federal research grants between 2011 and 2014. Their stated area of focus was emerging applications in neural mapping and cortical response simulation. Vantara's name appeared nowhere in the original investigation into Marcus Pruitt's accident. It appeared nowhere in his hospital admission records. But it appeared in his employment history. Marcus Allen Pruitt had worked for Vantara Biomedical as a research technician from March 2011 until June 2013, 6 weeks before the car accident on I-10 that put him in Hargrove. Corinne Batiste made a phone call to the Louisiana Secretary of State's office at 9:14 that morning to pull Vantara's current registration status. Vantara Biomedical had dissolved as a legal entity on August 18, 2013, 15 days after Marcus Pruitt was admitted to Hargrove Neurological Institute. The timing was not lost on her. But here is where the investigation took a turn that Delia Marsh had not seen coming. The one variable she had not been able to account for in 8 years of meticulous, sleepless documentation. Corinne Batiste, digging through the dissolved company's last filed corporate paperwork, found a list of registered directors. There were 4 names. She recognized the third one immediately. Not from the Vantera file. Not from the Pruitt file. From the case that had started everything. From the Morrow Street homicide. From the incident report she had reviewed the night before, filed by the first officer on scene in October 2015. The third registered director of Vantera Biomedical was Raymond Fels. The first victim. The man in whose kitchen the impossible fingerprint had first appeared. Raymond Fels had not been a random target. Raymond Fels had known Marcus Pruitt, had worked with him, had, in some capacity that was not yet clear, been part of whatever Vantera Biomedical had actually been doing in those years before the accident. And then Corinne scrolled down to the 4th name on the director list. She read it twice. She sat back in her chair. She picked up her phone and called Delia Marsh. And when Delia answered on the 2nd ring, Corinne said, very quietly, Delia, who authorized Marcus Pruitt's admission to Hargrove? Who signed the intake paperwork? There was a pause on the line. It's in the file, Delia said. Bottom of the folder. I found it 14 months ago. I didn't know what to do with it. Nothing could have prepared Corinne Batiste for what she was looking at when she reached the bottom of that folder. The intake authorization for Marcus Allen Pruitt, dated August 3, 2013, signed by his designated medical proxy, the single individual who had legal authority over every decision made about his care for the past decade, who had approved his treatment protocols, who had unrestricted, documented access to room 14C at Hargrove Neurological Institute at any hour of the day or night, was signed by Gerald Oubre, Delia Marsh's supervisor, the heavy-set former detective she had called on October 13, 2015. The first person she had told. The man who had sat beside her and looked at the screen and said nothing for a long time before telling her to file it under pending verification and go home. The man who, Corinne now realized with a cold and absolute clarity, had spent 8 years standing directly beside the only person in Louisiana law enforcement who was close to understanding what was happening. Corinne pulled up Gerald Oubre's personnel file. He had retired from the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab in April of 2023. 7 months ago. Standard retirement, full pension, no flags, no disciplinary record. She pulled up his home address from the state employee database. Then she called dispatch and requested an immediate welfare check. The responding officer arrived at Gerald Oubre's house on Sycamore Ridge Drive in Baton Rouge at 10:52 a.m. The front door was unlocked. The lights were on. There was a half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen table, still faintly warm. Gerald Oubre was not there. But on the kitchen table next to the coffee cup was a single sheet of paper. Printed, not handwritten. 11 words. Asterisk, she was never looking for the killer. She was the experiment. Asterisk. And somewhere in Baton Rouge, Delia Marsh's phone went straight to voicemail. They found Delia Marsh's car at 12:31 p.m., parked at an angle outside the Hargrove Neurological Institute, engines still running. The driver's door was open. Her phone was on the seat. She had left in a hurry, or she had been made to leave in a hurry. And at that point, with everything Corinne Batiste now knew, the distinction felt unbearably important. Corinne arrived at Hargrove 11 minutes later with 2 additional investigators and a warrant she had obtained in record time from a judge who, after being briefed for approximately 4 minutes, had signed without asking a single follow-up question. Sometimes the facts speak at a volume that makes procedure feel thin and inadequate. This was one of those times. What they found inside Hargrove Neurological Institute on November 14, 2023 was not a crime scene in any traditional sense. It was something closer to an answer, and like most answers to questions this dark, it was worse than the uncertainty that had preceded it. The hospital administrator, a composed woman named Dr. Sylvia Tran, met Corinne in the lobby with the expression of someone who had been awake since before the room was found empty, and had spent every hour since constructing a careful internal architecture of deniability. She led them to the basement. Not to room 14C on the 14th floor where Marcus Pruitt had ostensibly spent a decade in a vegetative state. To the basement. To a records room that, according to the building schematic, did not officially exist. Behind a fire door that required a keycard registered to a staff member who had resigned in 2019, they found a room approximately the size of a large office. Inside it were three things that Corinne Batiste would spend the rest of her career trying to adequately describe to people who had not seen them. The first was a bank of servers, compact, expensive, clearly not standard hospital equipment, connected to a hardwired network that did not appear on any of Hargrove's official IT infrastructure diagrams. The second was a medical recliner, the kind used for extended monitoring procedures, fitted with a custom array of EEG sensors and what a forensic neurologist later identified as a portable transcranial magnetic stimulation apparatus, a device capable, under the right conditions, of stimulating specific regions of the brain remotely, non-invasively, and without the knowledge of the subject. The third was Delia Marsh, sitting upright in a chair in the corner of the room, conscious, unharmed, and holding a manila folder against her chest with both hands like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She looked up when Corinne entered, and the first thing she said was, "I know where Gerald is, and I know what Marcus Pruitt actually was." Here is what the investigation ultimately established over the course of the 18 months that followed. Drawing on the server data, the Vantara Biomedical Research Archives recovered from an encrypted cloud backup, the testimony of two former Vantara employees who came forward separately, and the confessions, partial, lawyered, deeply self-serving but ultimately corroborating, of Gerald Oubre, who was arrested at Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport on the evening of November 14, 2023, attempting to board a flight to Lisbon under his own name, which told you something about how rattled he was because Gerald Oubre was not, by any account, a stupid man. Vantara Biomedical had never been primarily a research firm. It had been, from its founding in 2010, a privately funded project with a single operational objective: to determine whether a sufficiently precise pattern of remote neural stimulation could be used to induce unconscious, directed behavior in a human subject, action taken without awareness, without memory, and without any cortical signature that a standard clinical assessment would recognize as volitional. In simpler terms, could you make a person do something without them knowing they were doing it? Marcus Allen Pruitt had not been a research technician at Vantara. He had been the research. He had been recruited in 2011 under a legitimate employment contract, subjected over the following 2 years to an escalating program of neural mapping so comprehensive that Vantara's lead researcher, a man named Dr. Emmett Caulfield, who has never been found, whose name appears on the corporate filings as the second registered director, and who remains the single open thread in a case that is otherwise, brutally, completely closed, had effectively built a functional map of every motor and autonomic pathway in Marcus Pruitt's nervous system. The car accident on I-10 on June 22, 2013 was not an accident. The toxicology from the original crash report, reviewed by an independent forensic pharmacologist engaged by Corinne's team in January 2024, identified trace metabolites in Marcus Pruitt's stored blood samples consistent with a class of experimental GABAergic compounds that, at sufficient dosage, would produce a state of profound motor incapacitation while leaving deeper autonomic and subcortical function largely intact. He had been chemically immobilized, placed in Hargrove under Gerald Oubre's legal authority as his designated proxy, and connected, through the server array in the basement, through the sensor apparatus that had been installed in room 14C under the pretense of standard neurological monitoring equipment, to Vantara's guidance system. For 8 years, Marcus Pruitt had been conscious. Not fully, not in any way that mapped onto normal waking experience. The forensic neurologist who reviewed the server data described his state as something analogous to dreaming. A deep, recurring dream from which he could not wake while his body, responding to remote stimulation patterns delivered through the sensors, moved through the world and did things he did not choose and could not remember. The 23 victims were all people who had known too much, documented too much, or were positioned to ask the wrong questions about what Vantara had actually done. Raymond Fels, the first victim, had been trying for months before his death to access archived research files that Vantara's dissolution had rendered technically ownerless. Paula Drennan had been the notary who processed Vantara's original incorporation documents and had, in a private conversation recorded by a wiretap on an unrelated case, mentioned that she had retained copies. Terry Okafor had been a paralegal at the firm that had administered the federal grants, and had begun, quietly, to notice that the expenditure reports did not match the stated research outputs. 23 people who, in their various capacities, had gotten close enough to the truth that the system, Gerald Oubre managing the logistics, Emmett Caulfield operating the guidance architecture remotely, and Marcus Pruitt's body carrying out the physical work with no knowledge that it was happening, had reached out and removed them. And Delia Marsh. The note on Gerald Oubre's kitchen table. She was never looking for the killer. She was the experiment. Was not a confession. It was a warning that arrived too late to be useful. Because Delia Marsh had been selected as the next target. She had been selected, Corinne came to believe, at least a year before the room was found empty. The plan had always been to use Marcus Pruitt's disappearance to draw Delia to Hargrove, alone, at a moment of maximum urgency, because she was the only person who understood enough of the case to credibly threaten what remained of the operation. What disrupted that plan was the thing that disrupts most careful plans. An unanticipated variable. The nurse who found the empty room had been scheduled for the overnight shift for the first time in 3 months, substituting for a colleague who had called in sick. She found the room 11 minutes earlier than the original shift nurse would have. Those 11 minutes meant that the alert went out, the calls were made, and Corinne Batiste began pulling files before Gerald Oubre could execute the final stage of whatever sequence had been set in motion. He had panicked, and panicking men make visible mistakes. As for Marcus Allen Pruitt himself, he was found at 3:17 p.m. on November 14, 2023, in a maintenance corridor 2 floors below the records room. He was seated against the wall, his knees drawn up, wearing a hospital gown. He was conscious. He was, by every assessment conducted in the hours and days that followed, genuinely and fully conscious for what neurologists who reviewed his case later suggested might have been the first sustained time in over a decade. He did not speak when they found him. He looked at Corinne Batiste when she crouched in front of him, and the expression on his face was one she described in her debrief as something she did not have professional language for. A look she had only ever seen on the faces of people who had survived things that the human mind had not been designed to survive. He would spend the following year in a genuine rehabilitation facility, undergoing the kind of careful, documented, ethically reviewed neurological care that had been grotesquely mimicked during his captivity. His prognosis, as of the last public statement released by his legal team in late 2024, was cautiously described as improving. He has not given any public interviews. He has not been required to. Gerald Oubre was convicted on November 9, 2024, just over a year after his arrest, on 23 counts of felony murder, 1 count of unlawful imprisonment, and 4 counts of conspiracy to commit medical fraud. He was sentenced to life without parole. He declined to make a statement at sentencing. He looked, in every photograph taken outside the courthouse, like a man who had already been somewhere very far away for a very long time. Delia Marsh testified at his trial for 4 hours. She was precise. She was exhaustive. She did not cry. When the verdict was read, she sat completely still for a long moment, and then she gathered her notes, put them in her bag, and walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone. She resigned from the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab in January of 2025. The letter she submitted cited personal reasons. People who know her say she has moved somewhere quiet, somewhere without much of a case backlog, somewhere she can sleep. And Dr. Emmett Caulfield, the architect of all of it, the man who built the system, the man who aimed it, the man whose name sits on corporate documents filed in a dissolved company in a state where nobody was looking, has not been found. Interpol has an active notice. The FBI's fugitive unit has a file. Forensic accountants have traced financial instruments across 4 countries and lost the thread in the Cayman Islands sometime in mid-2022. He is somewhere. With his research. With 11 years of data on what the human nervous system can be made to do without the person inside it ever knowing. That is the part that does not resolve. That is the part that Corinne Batiste still thinks about, in the specific and grinding way that investigators think about open ends. Not dramatically, not cinematically, but in the quiet moments between other things, when the mind reaches for something it cannot touch. Because here is what the Pruitt case ultimately proved, in the most horrible empirical fashion imaginable. The body can be used. The body can be directed. The body can move through the world and do unthinkable things while the person inside it sleeps. And the only reason we know that this happened, The only reason 23 murders were solved, one man was freed, and another was sent to prison, is because a woman with dark hair pulled back too tight put a small asterisk next to an anomalous fingerprint on an October morning in 2015, and refused, for 8 years, to let it go. Most cases break because someone made a mistake. This one broke because someone cared too much to look away. Remember that the next time you are tempted to dismiss the thing that doesn't quite fit, the detail that refuses to resolve, the answer that should be simple but somehow never is. Delia Marsh did not solve this case because she was exceptional. She solved it because she was stubborn. And stubbornness, in the face of something vast and deliberately obscured, turns out to be its own kind of forensic tool. Every week, Mindshift Stories brings you the cases that keep investigators awake at night, the ones too disturbing for mainstream media. If that sounds like something you need, subscribe now and never miss a story.